So let's talk about a line. A line our justice system draws in a sand that seems so simple, but it has these massive, life-altering consequences. It's the line that separates a kid from an adult, and it's drawn, as you know, right at the age of 18. Okay, let's just dive right in with a question that gets to the absolute heart of it. What really is the difference between being 17 and, 364 days old and turning 18? Biologically, pretty much nothing. But in the eyes of the law, oh, everything changes. A single birthday, just 24 hours, can completely change the path of a young person's life if they get in trouble. And this line right here shows just how stark that change really is. I mean, look at this. The youth justice system in Canada is built around this idea of rehabilitation. It accepts that young people just have a, quote, reduced level of maturity. The whole goal is to figure out why they offended and help them. But the second you blow out those 18 candles, you're in the adult system. And that system is all about punishment, retribution, and making an example of you. So here's the bottom line. On one side of this invisible line, the system is designed to help you. On the other, it's designed to punish you. So to really get why we draw this line where we do, and to ask if it's even in the right place, we've got to go on a bit of a journey. We're going to look at the line itself, then we're going to jump back in time to ask a bigger question. Where did our idea of childhood even come from? Then we'll see how it's built today, look at the science, and finally ask what needs to change. All right, let's start with an idea that might sound a little strange at first. We think of childhood as this natural, universal thing, right? But what if it's not? What if it's something we as a society invented? To really understand that line at 18, we have to tackle this much bigger, kind of mind-bending question. And that brings us to this really groundbreaking and, let's be honest, super controversial claim from a historian named Philippe Ariès. Back in the 60s, he wrote that in the Middle Ages, the whole idea of childhood as the separate, protected phase of life, it just didn't exist. His famous argument was that as soon as a kid could basically survive without their mom, they were just thrown into adult society. Okay, so let's unpack that because it's a big claim. Now, a lot of historians have pushed back on this, saying he kind of overstated his case. But his main point is still really powerful. He wasn't saying medieval parents didn't love their kids. What he was saying is that the social wall between the world of kids and the world of adults, it just wasn't there. He'd look at medieval paintings and see children who just looked like miniature adults, wearing the same clothes, doing the same things. The big takeaway from his work is that childhood is a social construction. It's an idea we build as a society, not just a biological fact. So let's fast forward a few hundred years to the 19th century, because this is where our modern idea of childhood really starts to take shape. But it's an idea that's born from this huge contradiction. On one hand, you get the rise of the innocent, perfect, angelic child. And on the other hand, you have the brutal, harsh reality of the Industrial Revolution. And here is that contradiction, laid out plain and simple. The Victorian era gave us this romantic ideal of childhood as this pure, precious time that had to be protected from the big, bad adult world. Think of all those Charles Dickens novels with kids like Oliver Twist. But at the exact same time, the entire economy was running on the backs of children. As Queen Victoria's own husband said, a working man's kids were just part of his productive power. So while society was writing poems about childhood innocence, it was also sending millions of kids into deadly mines and factories. This just goes to show that creating that protected space for childhood wasn't some quick flip of a switch. It was a long, slow, grinding fight. I mean, just look at these dates. The first big Factory Act had so many loopholes, it was almost useless. It took until 1870 just to get a national school system going. And get this, in 1891, the minimum age for part-time factory work was raised from 10 to 11. It's not until 1908 that Canada even gets its first law creating a separate justice system for kids, finally saying in black and white that they're different from adults. All right, so that brings us up to today. We've seen that childhood is something we've built over time. So how do we build it now? Well, the answer is we do it through this massive, complicated web of laws, rules, and expectations that tells us what a child is, what they can do, and how we should treat them. And if you just look at our own laws, you can see how kind of arbitrary these lines really are. It's like we hand out adulthood in little pieces. At 16, you can make these huge life decisions like quitting school or getting married. At 17, you can drive a car or even fly a plane. But you can't vote until 18. And you can't even supervise a learner driver until you're 21. There's no single aha moment when you become an adult. We just sort of dole it out in this patchwork that doesn't always seem to make a lot of sense. There's actually a name for this. A sociologist named Jane Pilcher calls it separateness. And her point is that the most important feature of our modern idea of childhood is that it is totally separate from adulthood. We enforce that separation with everything. The laws we just saw, special schools, different clothes, different everything. Childhood is a space we have deliberately built to be not adults. And that very idea is the whole reason we have a separate youth justice system to begin with. But just like the Victorians, we have our own big contradiction. Another sociologist, Wendy Stainton Rogers, points out that we have these two completely opposite ways of looking at kids. On one hand, they're these innocent angels we have to protect from everything. That's the logic behind child welfare laws. But on the other hand, we see them as potentially wicked little devils that need to be controlled and punished. And that's the logic driving the youth justice system. We want to protect them and punish them at the same time, and our laws are stuck right in the middle of that tension. And this brings us right back to where we started, that sharp, unforgiving line at age 18. We've seen that our idea of childhood is something we made up over time. But what happens when that social idea crashes head-on into modern science and into the truly devastating real-world results of how we define it in law? Because here's the scientific bombshell. While our laws draw a hard line at 18, neuroscience draws a much fuzzier, later one, somewhere around age 25. Overwhelmingly, research shows that the prefrontal cortex, that's the part of your brain that's in charge of things like impulse control, thinking about the future and weighing consequences, it's one of the very last parts to finish cooking. This means that young adults, people from 18 to 24, are actually way more like teenagers than fully mature adults when it comes to making decisions, especially when they're stressed out or emotional. Now check out this data. It shows that young adults, that 18 to 24-year-old group, have the highest rate of police-reported crime of any age group. Just let that sink in for a second. The very group whose brains we know are still developing, the group that we abruptly kick out of the helpful youth system and into the punishing adult one, is statistically the most likely group to get in trouble with the law. This isn't just a theory. It's a cold, hard fact. And sometimes this collision between a rigid legal line and a developing human being leads to just absolute tragedy. The case of Ashley Smith is a truly harrowing example. She first got into the youth system when she was 14. Right after she turned 18, she was moved into the adult federal prison system. In less than a year, she was shuttled between prisons 16 times, spending nearly all of that time in solitary confinement, even though she was clearly suffering from severe mental illness. Ashley died alone in her cell at 19 years old. A coroner's inquest later ruled her death a homicide. Not an accident, a homicide. They said it was a direct result of a system that completely failed her, that was totally unequipped to deal with the complex needs of a vulnerable, mentally ill young person. Her case stands as this tragic monument to the fatal consequences of treating an 18-year-old like just another hardened adult criminal. So, if the line at 18 is arbitrary, if it clashes with the science, and if it can lead to such tragic outcomes, what's the alternative? We have to ask what should change. So let's look at some potential solutions, see what other places are doing, and what the experts think we should do. Well, first off, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Let's take a look at Germany. They've recognized this developmental stage for decades. Their youth courts can handle cases for people up to age 21. The focus is always on rehabilitation and finding a solution that fits the person's maturity level, not just the crime. And if they do end up incarcerated, they're put in juvenile facilities with teachers and psychologists and support all the way up to age 24. And this isn't just some European thing either. Just a few years ago, Vermont became the first U.S. state to raise the age of juvenile jurisdiction. Their whole goal is to connect these young adults with services that actually fit their age to stop them from reoffending. They've even built separate facilities for 18 to 25-year-olds and made it easier to get records cleared because they recognize that a mistake you make at 19 shouldn't ruin the rest of your life. So what about here in Canada? The St. Leonard Society laid out some really concrete, common-sense ideas. In the short term, they're calling for practical stuff, help finding a job, life skills classes, things that actually address the reasons people get in trouble. They recommend creating special facilities just for that 18 to 24 age group. And, most importantly, they say our policies have to be guided by the brain science we've been talking about. Which brings us to this final question. We've seen that our idea of childhood isn't set in stone. It was built through history, and it's still being shaped by science and culture every day. So if our understanding of what it means to be young is constantly evolving, and if the science is screaming at us that the brain is a work in progress long after 18, then the question we have to ask is, why are our laws so slow to catch up? Shouldn't they evolve too?